Mark had always believed that relationships were built on trust. He and Emma had been together for 6 years, married for 4. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and for the most part, he was happy. At least, he thought he was. Looking back, maybe he was just in denial, blind to the signs that started small but grew into glaring truths he could no longer ignore. It started with the little things. Emma would come home late from work, her phone glued to her hand, laughing at texts she wouldn't share. He noticed she'd become more secretive. At first, Mark brushed it off as paranoia. They were both busy, he, with his job in construction management, and her, as an interior designer. Life was hectic. It was normal for people to drift and find their space. One night, she returned home much later than usual. The faint smell of alcohol and expensive cologne clung to her, mixing with the faint traces of her usual vanilla perfume. Mark's mind flashed to the possibility that she might be seeing someone else. He felt a knot forming in his stomach, but he kept quiet, telling himself it was nothing. She was just out with clients. It was innocent, right? But over the next few weeks, things escalated. Emma started going out even more often, and her explanations became vaguer. He tried to join her for a night out, but she always had an excuse. It's a girls' night, or this is a work thing. You wouldn't enjoy it? He didn't push it. He didn't want to be that guy. The one who controlled his wife, demanded explanations for everything. But the gnawing in his gut wouldn't leave him alone. Mark's first real suspicion came when Emma was out late again, supposedly working on a big project. That night, he couldn't sleep, so he grabbed her tablet, which he sometimes used for work, thinking he'd pass the time. When he opened it, though, something strange happened. Her email was already logged in. Curiosity got the better of him. He told himself it was innocent. He just wanted to know if she'd really been working so hard. What he found was a long thread of messages with a name he didn't recognize, John R. The conversation was flirty, intimate. His heart pounded in his chest as he scrolled through lines of text that felt like a stab in the back with each swipe. You looked so good today. I can't stop thinking about last night. I miss you already, babe. Mark's vision blurred with fury. His breath quickened as his world came crashing down. She was cheating. She had to be. But that wasn't even the worst part. As he kept scrolling, he saw a message from earlier that day. Tonight was amazing. Can't wait to see you again next week. It was from just a few hours before she came home, smiling as if nothing had happened. The rage inside him surged like a tidal wave. His hands shook, and he could hear his own heartbeat pulsing in his ears. He wanted to confront her right then and there, but he held back, gathering himself. If she had been lying to him this long, he needed proof. Solid, undeniable proof. That was when Mark's transformation began. He decided to be patient. He would watch her, let her dig herself deeper, and when the time was right, he'd strike. For the next month, Mark played along, pretending everything was fine. It was torturous, acting like the devoted husband while his wife was off with another man. Every time she smiled, kissed him, or said she loved him, it felt like poison seeping into his veins. He kept his distance, but not too much. He needed her to believe nothing had changed, to make her feel safe in her web of lies. His patience paid off. Emma became more reckless, slipping into her affair with less caution. One night, she forgot her phone at home when she went out for drinks. The opportunity was too perfect. Mark couldn't resist. He unlocked it easily and scrolled through her texts with John R. again. The messages confirmed everything. She wasn't just cheating. She was deep in an ongoing affair. There were plans to meet up at a hotel later that week. Mark's blood boiled, but instead of reacting, he planned. The night of their next meeting, he followed her. She thought he was working late, but he had taken the night off, parked down the street, and waited. Sure enough, she left the house, dressed in her best, looking stunning, like the woman he had once fallen in love with. He trailed her to a small, upscale hotel downtown. Mark's heart pounded with every step as he watched her head inside. Part of him still couldn't believe it, but the truth was undeniable now. He waited outside, his thoughts racing, imagining what was happening behind those closed doors. An hour passed, then 2. Finally, she came out, hair tousled, her dress slightly wrinkled, walking hand in hand with John R. It was all Mark could do not to charge at them, to drag them both into the street and make a scene. Instead, he clenched his fists and watched as they kissed before getting into separate cabs. This time, though, he wasn't going to let it go. He wasn't going to be quiet anymore. Emma was going to pay for what she had done, and Mark had a dark, vengeful plan forming in the back of his mind. Mark couldn't sleep that night. The images of Emma kissing another man burned into his mind like a permanent scar. Every fiber of his being screamed for revenge. But he needed to be smart about it. If he was going to make her pay, it had to be on his terms. He would hurt her, break her the way she had broken him. Over the next week, Mark continued to gather evidence. He took screenshots of her text messages, recorded phone calls when she snuck out of the house, and even managed to plant a small recording device in her purse. He knew this would all come in handy soon. But even with all the evidence he had, he wasn't ready to confront her yet. Not until everything was perfect. The more he watched Emma slip out of their life together, the more he began to think about how he could destroy hers. He wanted to hurt her as much as she had hurt him, but in a way that would leave her in shambles, emotionally, socially, and even financially. The gears in his mind churned relentlessly, formulating a plan. One night, he approached her with a smile on his face, masking the turmoil beneath. "You've been working so hard lately," he said. "Why don't we plan a weekend getaway? Just the two of us." Emma looked startled at first, but quickly covered it up with a sweet, practiced smile. "That sounds great, Mark. I've been so stressed with work. I could really use it." Mark suppressed a smirk. She was probably already thinking about how to sneak away and cancel her plans with John R. That was fine. This wasn't just a weekend getaway. It was a trap. The following Friday, they arrived at a secluded cabin deep in the woods, far from the city and any prying eyes. Mark had made sure every detail was perfect. No cell service, no internet, just the two of them, and everything he needed to execute his revenge. The first night was quiet. He played the part of the loving husband well, pouring her favorite wine, lighting candles, making small talk that felt normal enough to keep her from becoming suspicious. They even spent the evening by the fireplace, pretending to enjoy each other's company like old times. Emma seemed relaxed, probably thinking that the affair was safe, that she could continue to fool him. She had no idea the storm that was about to hit. On the second night, Mark made his move. After a quiet dinner, he suggested they play a game, a harmless suggestion with a sinister edge hiding beneath. "How about a little truth or dare?" Mark asked, his tone casual, but his eyes fixed on her. Emma raised an eyebrow, a playful grin dancing on her lips. "Truth or dare? Really? Are we teenagers again?" Mark smiled, leaning back in his chair. "Why not? We could use some fun." She shrugged, clearly not sensing the danger. "All right. Truth. Have you ever cheated on me?" The question came out as smooth as silk, though the silence that followed was electric, heavy with tension. Emma froze, her wine glass hovering just inches from her lips. For a moment, her face was a blank mask, but then she laughed, a forced, nervous sound. "What kind of question is that?" "Of course not." Mark's smile never wavered. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "Are you sure about that?" With one click, he played a voice recording. It was her, talking to John, about their next meeting, about their last meeting. Her words echoed in the room, filling the air with undeniable proof. Emma's face drained of color. She dropped the glass, shattering it on the wooden floor. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Mark stood up, his eyes cold, emotionless. "I know everything. The sneaking around, the lies, the hotel. All of it." Emma tried to speak, her voice a whisper. "I can explain." "Explain?" Mark scoffed, stepping closer, his presence towering over her. "Explain how you've been cheating for months, how you made me feel like a fool, how you've been living two lives and thought I wouldn't notice." Tears welled up in her eyes. "Please, Mark. I was going to end it. I was going to stop, I swear." Mark's laugh was hollow, echoing through the cabin like the howl of a wolf. "Stop? You didn't stop the first time, or the second, or the third. You were never going to stop. You just got caught." He watched as Emma broke down, her sobs filling the room. But Mark felt nothing. No pity. No sympathy. She had turned their life into a lie, and now it was her turn to feel what it was like to lose everything. Emma reached for him, desperate, her hands trembling. "Please, let me explain. We can work through this. We can." But Mark stepped back, shaking his head. "There's nothing left to work through, Emma. You're done." With those final words, he turned and left the cabin, leaving her there, broken, with the weight of her betrayal crushing down on her. But this wasn't over. Not yet. He still had one more move to make. Emma had lost almost everything in the span of weeks. Her friends, the ones who had once adored her for her charm and seemingly perfect life, turned their backs on her. John R.'s wife had left him after receiving the damning evidence from Mark, and in a particularly vindictive move, she made sure to expose Emma publicly as the homewrecker in a scathing social media post that quickly went viral. Emma's career as an interior designer had been built on her reputation and connections, but now, no one wanted to be associated with her. Mark watched with grim satisfaction. It was exactly what she deserved. And yet, despite everything, he felt a strange emptiness inside. The revenge had brought him no peace, only a dark, lingering void where his heart had once been. But there was still one final part of his plan. He couldn't just let her walk away completely. No, he needed her to know that even after everything, he was still in control. Mark decided to pay her a visit. The house they once shared, now stripped of the warmth and love it once held, was the perfect place for the final act. He had moved out weeks ago, but Emma was still living there, likely because she had nowhere else to go. When he arrived, the sight of her shocked him. Emma looked like a ghost of the woman she once was. Her usually radiant skin was pale, her hair unkempt, and her eyes sunken from lack of sleep. The expensive clothes she used to flaunt were replaced by oversized sweats, and the house was a mess, something that would have been unthinkable just a few months ago. Mark stood at the doorway, his presence like a shadow looming over her. She looked up from the couch, where she sat clutching an empty wine glass in one hand, her fingers trembling slightly. It was clear she had been drinking heavily, and the bottles littered around the room told him this wasn't a one-time occurrence. "Mark," Emma's voice cracked as she spoke, her eyes widening with a mixture of shock and shame. She quickly stood up, stumbling slightly as she tried to regain some composure. Mark stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The sound of it clicking shut seemed to echo through the hollow space. "You're not looking too good, Emma." She didn't respond at first, just stared at him, her lips quivering as she searched for words. Finally, she managed a weak, "I'm sorry, Mark, for everything. I know I messed up, but I didn't realize it would end like this." He let her words hang in the air for a moment, cold and calculating. This was exactly where he wanted her, broken, desperate, and at his mercy. "I didn't come here to hear your apologies," he said, his voice steady and deliberate. "I came here because I wanted to see what you've become. What happens when a liar gets caught in their own web." Emma blinked, her eyes brimming with tears. She tried to move closer to him, but Mark raised his hand, stopping her in her tracks. "Please, Mark, I can't take this anymore. I lost my job, my friends. John doesn't even want to talk to me anymore." She sobbed, collapsing onto the couch, unable to hold back her tears. Mark watched, his face emotionless. Part of him wanted to feel satisfaction, but all he could feel was the coldness that had taken root inside him. He stepped closer, towering over her crumpled form. "You should have thought about that before you threw everything away," he said. "You lied. You cheated. And now you're left with nothing." Emma sobbed harder, clutching her head as if trying to shut out his words. But Mark wasn't done. "You'll live with this for the rest of your life, Emma. But that's not enough for me," he continued, his voice as sharp as a blade. "I want you to remember every single second of this. I want you to know that no matter what you do, no matter how many bottles you drown yourself in, I'll always be the one who took everything from you." Her sobs grew louder, raw and broken. She looked up at him, pleading, her makeup streaked with tears. "Please, Mark. I can't do this anymore. I'm so sorry. I don't know what else to say." He knelt down in front of her, his face inches from hers. For a moment, they stared at each other, the tension thick and suffocating. Then, with a chilling calmness, he whispered, "You should have thought about that before you destroyed our marriage." Emma's eyes widened as she took in his words. There was no more pleading, no more begging. She had nothing left to give. Mark stood up, the finality of his actions settling over him. He had destroyed her, just as she had destroyed him. But as he turned to leave, a strange realization hit him. The revenge hadn't made him whole again. He was still empty, just like her. Emma stared at the amber liquid swirling in her glass. For a moment, she considered downing the drink, letting it erase the edges of her pain, just like all the others had. But this time was different. This time, something inside her cracked open. A realization settled in her chest, cold and heavy. This was her fault. Everything that had happened, all the destruction in her life, she had caused it. No one forced her to lie, to sneak around, to betray the man who had once loved her with everything he had. She had done it willingly, selfishly, thinking that she could have it all. She thought she could play with fire and never get burned. But now, she was engulfed in the flames, and the weight of her actions pressed down on her like a crushing wave. Emma put the glass down on the table. Her hand shook violently as she leaned back, sinking into the couch. For the first time in weeks, she couldn't bring herself to drink. The alcohol wasn't going to fix this. It wasn't going to numb the pain anymore. She needed something else, something real, something she had lost long ago. But what was left for her now? She had ruined her marriage, destroyed her career, and alienated everyone she cared about. The isolation was unbearable, the silence in the house suffocating. That night, as she lay in bed staring up at the ceiling, the darkness pressed in from all sides. Sleep eluded her, the guilt gnawing at her like a relentless predator. She thought of Mark, how strong he had seemed when he confronted her. He was different now, colder, harder. He had taken everything from her, but the truth was, she had given him no choice. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she remembered their happier days, the laughter, the love, the trust. It felt like a lifetime ago. She had been careless, thinking she could escape the consequences. But there was no escaping this. Her mind wandered to darker thoughts, thoughts that scared her, thoughts that whispered in the back of her mind when the world was quiet and her heart was aching. Maybe it would be easier if it all just ended. The next morning, Emma woke up with the same heaviness pressing down on her chest. The sunlight filtered through the curtains, but it did nothing to brighten the emptiness she felt. She dragged herself out of bed, her limbs heavy, and wandered through the house aimlessly. Everything felt surreal, like she was living in a fog. The memories of her affair with John R. now felt distant, hazy, and insignificant compared to the devastation she faced. What was it all for? The excitement, the thrill, the forbidden lust. It had all burned out so quickly, leaving nothing but ash in its wake. Her phone buzzed again, a constant reminder that the world hadn't forgotten her shame. She ignored it, tossing it onto the counter as she poured herself a cup of black coffee. The bitter taste was a sharp contrast to the sweetness of the alcohol she had been drowning in for weeks, but it did nothing to lift the haze of despair that clung to her. As she sat in the kitchen, staring at the empty chairs around the table, she couldn't help but feel the weight of her loneliness. This house was a prison now, filled with memories of a life she had destroyed. A knock on the door startled her from her thoughts. She wasn't expecting anyone. Reluctantly, Emma stood up, smoothing down her disheveled clothes as she walked to the door. When she opened it, her heart stopped. Mark stood on the porch, his expression unreadable. His presence filled the space, a cold gust of wind blowing in behind him as he stepped forward. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice calm, but there was something darker lurking beneath it. Emma swallowed hard, her throat dry. She stepped aside, allowing him to enter. The tension between them was thick, the air heavy with unspoken words. Mark walked into the living room, his eyes scanning the room, taking in the mess, the empty bottles, the scattered remnants of her unraveling life. He said nothing at first, just stood there, hands in his pockets, as if weighing his next move. "I thought you were done with me," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. Mark turned to face her, his eyes cold and hard. I am. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She knew it was true. He was done with her. But why had he come back? I wanted to see what you've become, he said, his tone devoid of any emotion. I needed to know if you were still the same person who destroyed our life. I needed to see if you felt any remorse. Emma's breath hitched. She wanted to defend herself, to tell him that she was sorry, that she had made a mistake, that she wished she could take it all back. But the words wouldn't come. She had said them so many times already, and they had fallen on deaf ears. What was the point anymore? Mark took a step closer, his eyes boring into hers. Do you regret it? Her throat tightened. Yes, more than anything. He nodded, as if that was what he had expected to hear. But it didn't soften him. I'm glad to hear that, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Because you're going to live with that regret for the rest of your life? Emma's heart raced. There was something in his voice, something unsettling. What do you mean? Mark's lips twisted into a bitter smile. I've already taken everything from you. Your reputation, your career, your friends. Now, I just wanted to make sure you knew that this is only the beginning. She felt the weight of his words like a noose tightening around her neck. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as Mark's words hung in the air, heavy and threatening. The room felt colder, darker, as if his presence had drained all the warmth from it. She searched his face for any trace of the man she had once loved, the man who had been kind and forgiving, but he was gone. What stood before her now was someone she barely recognized, a man consumed by a darkness she had unleashed. I don't understand, she whispered, her voice trembling. Mark's smile faded, replaced by a steely calm that sent chills down her spine. You don't have to understand, Emma. Just know that the hell you're living in now is nothing compared to what's coming. This is only the start. Emma felt the ground beneath her feet shift. What more could he possibly take from her? He had already destroyed her life. She had lost everything, her job, her friends, her dignity. But the look in his eyes told her that he wasn't done, that there was something more, something she hadn't seen coming. He took another step closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. Do you know what the best part of all of this is? Emma shook her head, her throat dry, fear creeping into her veins. You did this to yourself, Mark continued, his tone laced with cruel satisfaction. All I did was let the truth come out. You handed me the weapons, and I used them. And now, you'll spend the rest of your life knowing that you're the one who set this all in motion. Her legs felt weak, and she sank down onto the couch, her hands trembling. She had nothing left to say, nothing left to fight for. The reality of her situation hit her like a sledgehammer. There was no escaping this. She was trapped in the life she had destroyed with her own hands, and Mark was the one holding the keys. But he wasn't finished yet. Mark walked over to the window, staring out at the dreary, overcast sky. I spoke with your parents, he said, his voice casual, as if they were having a normal conversation. Emma's stomach lurched. My parents? She asked, her voice barely audible. He nodded. They know everything. I made sure they understood exactly what kind of person their daughter had become. She felt the blood drain from her face. Her parents had always been her safety net, the people who would stand by her no matter what. But Mark had reached them too. He had poisoned everything. And they don't want anything to do with you, he said, turning back to face her, his eyes cold and merciless. They've disowned you. Emma gasped, the pain cutting deep. She had already lost so much, but hearing that her own family had turned their backs on her was unbearable. It was the final nail in the coffin. Mark's expression remained impassive as he continued. You have nothing left, Emma. No one. No job. No friends. Not even your family. You'll spend the rest of your life alone, paying for what you've done. And I'll be there, watching from the sidelines, knowing that you're suffering, knowing that every time you look in the mirror, you'll see the person who destroyed everything. Emma collapsed into sobs, her body shaking uncontrollably. She wanted to scream, to beg for mercy, but she knew it was useless. There was no mercy left in him, just as there was none left in her own shattered heart. Mark watched her crumble, his face a mask of cold satisfaction. He had won. He had taken everything from her, and now she was nothing more than a broken shell of the woman she once was. But just as he turned to leave, something stopped him. A flicker of doubt. A question that had been gnawing at him, even in the midst of his victory. Would this truly make him whole again? He paused at the door, his hand resting on the knob. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by Emma's soft sobs. The satisfaction he had expected to feel after watching her fall apart wasn't as fulfilling as he had imagined. He had spent weeks planning his revenge, executing every part of it with precision. But now that it was done, there was only emptiness. He glanced back at Emma, her once vibrant spirit completely crushed. There was no fight left in her. She wasn't the woman who had betrayed him anymore. She was just broken. Mark's hand dropped from the doorknob as he stood there, torn between his anger and the strange hollowness inside him. He had wanted revenge, and he had gotten it. But at what cost? For a moment, he wondered if he had become just as lost as she was. The man who stood here now wasn't the man he had been before all of this. The darkness he had unleashed on Emma had crept into him as well, leaving him colder, emptier. Finally, Mark took a deep breath and walked out the door, leaving the broken pieces of their past behind. There was no going back now. As he stepped into the cold morning air, the weight of what he had done pressed down on him. He had his revenge, but it hadn't brought him peace. It had only left them both in ruins.